Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History with Mr. Ansharsky. This is going to be the start of Unit 2, as we'll talk about in just a second. So welcome to a new unit. This unit, as we'll see in a second, all about trade. So we'll definitely cover a lot of economic themes and the results of trade as well. So that'll work on the screen, obviously. So thinking back to Units 1, Unit 0, what are some commodities that are being traded that we've talked about so far? Where are they from? So you'll definitely have a grasp on kind of where things are from because of this unit. All right. So this unit is called Networks of Exchange. And as the name might suggest, it's all about how trade is happening in Eurasia, in Europe, Asia, and Africa. So Afro-Eurasia. So the unit objective, what you are kind of responding to, what you definitely are responding to on the unit cover page, explain the similarities and differences among the various networks of exchange in the period from 1200 to 1450. So we will really talk about three major trading networks. And they are going to be the Silk Road, the topic of today's presentation, the Trans-Saharan trade, which will be another presentation, and of course the Indian Ocean trade as well. So those are the three big networks of exchange. What's similar, what's different about them? That's what you should be focusing on when answering this specific unit objective. But today we're going to talk about the Silk Road, which is arguably probably the most important of all of them. The Silk Road, of course, is not a single road, as the name might suggest, but rather it describes a series of trade networks between the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Byzantine Empire is, and all the way down over here in China. So the Silk Road is going to be the major kind of trading connection between Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa as well. So your lesson objective today, this is what you should be paying attention to, is the causes and effects of the growth of networks of exchange. Read that as the Silk Road after 1200. So what is causing the Silk Road to develop, and what are some effects of the Silk Road, essentially? And again, this is kind of just a depiction of the Silk Road, especially in the classical period. Because as we're going to see, the Silk Road does have its origins in the classical period. We've been kind of dancing around the edges of the Silk Road ever since we first introduced it with the Han Dynasty in China. And I'll bring them up again, don't worry. So let's talk about some of the origins of the Silk Road and kind of how it worked. We'll look at it kind of in its pre-classical origins, I should say in its classical origins, but then we'll look at it, what it looks like after the classical era, what it looks like between 600 and 1200 CE. So let's get started. So the Silk Road, as I mentioned before, does have its origins way back in what was our Unit 0 in the classical period. And really there are a few reasons why the Silk Road will first develop way back then. Well, for one thing, a big continuity in world history, as we will see going forward, is that when there is a sense of political stability, when there is political organization under a centralized, unified empire, that's when we are going to see networks of exchange being promoted and expanded. So in the classical period, remember, this was a time period of empires, of unified land-based empires. And there are really kind of three empires that are assisting with this classical era Silk Road. We have, of course, in China, the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty, as you remembered, a unified, centralized state in China that is able to support and promote intercontinental trade and diplomatic ties. The Han Dynasty has diplomatic relations, well, kind of very scattered and limited, but nonetheless present diplomatic relations with places like even Rome, for example. So the Han Dynasty, a major kind of origin point for the Silk Road. Way over in the east, we have the Roman Empire, but kind of in the middle to help facilitate these contacts between the Romans and the Chinese is going to be the Parthian Empire. And the Parthian Empire is kind of a successor state to the Persian Empire that we talked about way back in Unit 0, But the Parthian Empire is going to be kind of the connecting block between the Romans and the Chinese. And actually, we do see as early as 250 BCE evidence of contact between, well, at that point, the Roman Republic and China and the Han Dynasty. And they're largely going to meet in this Parthian Empire. So without this unified and stable state in Central Asia and the Middle East, we wouldn't have these trade networks able to function, basically. We are going to see that emissaries or ambassadors of the Roman Empire, they will trade alfalfa and glassware to the Chinese in exchange for Chinese horses and even silk. As you're going to see in a second, the Silk Road, its major commodity is, you guessed it, roads. No, I'm just kidding, silk. So we have a stable kind of unifying empires that will allow for trade to happen. Unified empires make trade safe, they build roads. That's why they're important for trade. But another major cause for the Silk Road to even come up in the first place is the demand for luxury goods. People want stuff they can only get in other places. People want silk from China, but China has a monopoly on silk. All of its silkworms are very closely guarded secrets. There is basically a government monopoly on silk in China. So how do you get silk? You have to trade for it. And even China doesn't have everything it wants. It wants glassware, especially from the Roman Empire. But as we all know, the classical period ends and these unifying empires will break apart. So let's look at developments of the Silk Road after the classical era, because there will be continuities, but there also are some changes. For one thing, one of the biggest changes is the lack of a unified empire, especially in Central Asia. So remember, the Han Dynasty collapses. We have the collapse of the Parthian Empire. We have the Romans going away. And really, in the post-classical period, the period between 600 and 1200 CE, we do have a lot of political chaos. Of course, there are some exceptions. We talked about different dynasties in China, but we also have kind of the Byzantine Empire. But it's that middle section that mostly is disorganized, ruled over by a bunch of different rivaling kingdoms. So really, trade is going to still happen, but it doesn't have a unified empire to promote and protect it, especially in Central Asia. But trade, as I mentioned before, is continuing. The demand for luxury goods is very high. People really want silk from China, for example. And as such, trade will happen, but it's going to largely be promoted not by a unified empire at this point, but by collection of Central Asian nomadic societies. So a big kind of change in the post-classical period is who is going to help direct all of this trade. We're going to see increased participation of the Khans, of the Central Asian nomads. And yet, as we're going to see later on, these Central Asian nomads, they oftentimes will result in as being bandits for trade across Eurasia. Some Central Asian nomads they will conduct with trade, and others will just take what they want. So before 1200 CE, the Silk Road is a pretty dangerous place to go on. It's like the Oregon Trail, but instead of getting dysentery, you get attacked by Central Asian nomads, or, you get the bubonic plague. That's a little joke from me to you. But let's look kind of at the Central Asian nomads a bit more, because they are a crucial part of the Silk Road during the post-classical period, and as we're going to see afterwards as well. And I kind of have this map up here just to show how divided Central Asia is, especially during the post-classical period, before the rise of the Mongols, who we'll talk about more in our next presentation. But it's a very dangerous place to travel right now. You don't have a unified, stable empire until, of course, the Mongols. And the Mongols, as we will see, will promote a protected Silk Road. There's a single unified empire, and that is going to allow for an expansion of Silk Road trade. But we will definitely look at that more coming up. But let's look at the Central Asian nomads a bit, because I keep mentioning them. But it is kind of important to realize who some of these groups are and how they are helping trade happen. Well, for one thing, Central Asian nomads are involved in kind of all aspects of overland trade in Eurasia. For one thing, oftentimes they're the ones who provide the basic form of transportation, either with camels in the Middle East or with horses. So Central Asian nomads very skilled at nomadic lifestyle, obviously, as their name might suggest, but also they are very skilled as horse raisers, as camel raisers as well. But some Central Asian nomads, as I mentioned earlier, are going to involve themselves in trade. But others, some will involve themselves in bandit attacks. Others are essentially going to be kind of bodyguards in a way. Some Central Asian nomads will help trade happen by providing a sense of protection for some of these merchant companies. It's very important to realize that all Central Asian nomads are not unified in any possible way. It is a it is a collection of a variety of different nomadic societies, ranging from the Mongols all the way in what is today Mongolia to Bedouin groups in the Arabian Peninsula. But a big part of Central Asian involvement in overland trade is how sometimes they will operate as merchants. And really, they're operating as merchants in a way because they lack natural resources that they can't get as nomads. For example, they can't get metals very easily, and metalworking is very important, as we all know today. Metalworking is important in terms of basic kind of tools that they might need for weapons, obviously. So oftentimes we will see Central Asian nomads have a financial slash material motive for involving themselves in the exchange of goods. And oftentimes they might buy something in China and then take it to another place, to say some place like Samarkand, as we'll talk about later, and they will kind of foster this exchange of goods. And really, Central Asian nomads can get the goods they need through trade or through raiding. And that's why we often see Central Asian nomadic tribes raiding sedentary civilizations like the Chinese, for example. We talked about how the collapse of many a Chinese dynasty happened because of raids from Central Asian nomads. But it's important to kind of realize what is being traded on the Silk Road, kind of fostering that idea of how demand for luxury goods leads to trade in the first place. Well, for one thing, from the Middle East, we have rugs and spices, we have citrus like lemons that will be diffused into Europe, for example. In Africa, we have gold and salt, gold from West Africa, salt from North Africa. We have timber, frankincense, bananas. Bananas will make their way into Southeast Asia thanks to trade networks like the Silk Road. India, the kind of big thing to remember from India is that they have two things that everybody wants: spices, especially pepper, and textiles. India, really until 1750, is going to be the world's major producer of cotton textiles. Afterwards, it will shift to the British, but we'll talk about that later. But India is a prime destination for spices and textiles. Southeast Asia, as we mentioned in our last unit, is the origin of champa rice, which is a drought-resistant rice that will make it very big in China. But China is the biggest of them all in terms of producing things people want. And what do people want on the Silk Road? Well, it's its namesake, silk. But the Chinese also have various inventions. They have porcelain, or well, I don't know if that counts as an invention, but it's a luxury good that is demanded. And of course, another name for porcelain is, fittingly, China. We also have gunpowder, we have printed paper, or, well, the printing press, we have paper. So China is going to be a prime destination for a lot of manufactured goods, actually. That's another big continuity in economic world history, is that manufactured goods largely come from China, until 1750, until the European Industrial Revolution. But we'll get there, don't worry. I actually have those videos already posted. So never mind, I won't say. I mean, you should be focused on Unit 2 right now, not looking ahead to Unit 5. But let's look at these nomadic societies a little bit, because they're the ones causing, in a way, they are the ones leading to the growth of Central Asian trade along the Silk Road. Well, there are some general similarities, and I made a typo right there, but it's okay. But these societies, they range in what exactly their cultural practices are, their religious customs, even, their livelihoods in general. But there are some general similarities. For one thing, many of these societies are pastoral, meaning they move from pasture to pasture. You probably talked about this in Human Geo. So many of them are pastoral, primarily moving around animals like goats, like sheep, like horses, like camels, these sorts of livestock. But generally, kind of these Central Asian nomads, they generally will depend on caravans. They will depend on these large collection of people on horseback that are moving from place to place. And caravans kind of allow Central Asian nomads to move from place to place because it is a way to protect themselves. And this will actually be a strategy that will be employed by many merchant companies on the Silk Road. They will travel as caravans. And you can see a picture of a kind of smaller caravan, but these could be huge caravans. They could have like hundreds of people in them. But one of the big kind of similarities of many Central Asian nomadic societies is that they are somehow involved in overland trade. And another big thing is that as a result of this involvement in trade, as a result of the kind of nomadic lifestyle they lead, Central Asian nomads will be responsible for diffusion across Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia. And then just to provide some examples of these Central Asian nomadic societies and especially how they adapt to their natural environment, I've seen AP questions about this. I've seen short answer questions about this on practice APs. So it is important to provide some examples of how nomadic societies are adapting to their natural environment. Well, many nomadic societies are going to be pastoral because really their environment isn't suitable for sedentary agriculture, for farming. So, in the case of the Middle East and North Africa, some nomadic societies, they are going to engage, well, I mean, probably all of them are going to engage in a pastoral lifestyle, namely because they can't acquire natural resources like, or well, I should clarify, they can't really farm because of the lack of water. Because of the limited water resources, there's a limited kind of sedentary farming communities across North Africa and the Middle East, with few exceptions, obviously. But in terms of Central Asia, kind of they're adapting as well to a rather arid environment, or at least one that isn't suitable for large-scale farming, for large-scale sedentary farming. Most Central Asian nomads, they live on what is called the steppes. And the steppes, basically a grassland region that's really suitable for pastoral grazing for animals. And as a result of the lack of kind of settling down, these nomadic societies, both in the Middle East and North Africa and Central Asia, they're going to have to trade for resources. They're going to have to engage in either raiding, which will be more frequent among nomadic communities in Central Asia, but also trade as well. Kind of a difference in terms of religion between these two groups of people. Middle Eastern and North African Central Asian nomads, they tend to be Muslims. They want to connect to overland Muslim trade routes. But we also do see that, or I should say, kind of in contrast, we don't see really a unified religion among Central Asian nomads. Some are Muslim, some are some are Christian. We'll talk about a variety of that later on today. Some are Buddhist, others are kind of practicing native religions like Tengrism that we'll talk about more with the Mongols. And then some natural examples with the Middle East and North Africa. We got the Arab Bedouins. They're mostly on the Arabian Peninsula, but they will kind of travel outside of that, especially as the Islam is rising. We also have the Berbers in North Africa. Some of them are sedentary, others of them are nomadic. With Central Asian nomads, kind of something that is unique about them that I haven't mentioned already is that many of them will kind of develop skills in mounted warfare. The Central Asian nomads are going to promote horseback warfare. And that's going to be kind of a major reason why they're so gosh dang effective at covering such a large amount of territory. And then some examples of these Central Asian nomadic societies. We have the Scythians. They kind of run those protection rackets that I mentioned earlier. But the biggest example are the Mongols, and we'll talk about them more later on. So you should be able to answer this question right here. What factors led to the growth of the Silk Road? And kind of think about how there's a difference between the classical period and the post-classical period. But finally, let's wrap up with what are the effects of the Silk Road? Because boy howdy, there are a few. For one thing, we are going to see some economic impacts of the Silk Road, as you might imagine. We are going to see the rise of trading cities across Central Asia, cities that will be kind of stopping points for Silk Road trade. For example, we see the rise of places like Samarkand and Mosul. Samarkand will be kind of a center point of the Silk Road. It's a point in modern day Turkmenistan, I believe. It's somewhere in Central Asia. And it is going to be kind of the center of the Silk Road. And as such, it will be a kind of urbanized trading community. A big result of the Silk Road, and I can't underscore this enough, is going to be the rise of urbanized societies across Central Asia, leading to the creation of cities like Samarkand and, over in Iraq, Mosul. But we also see, because of this expansion of economic activity across the Silk Road, we are going to see some new economic practices to help facilitate that. For one thing, one of these kind of new practices is going to be the idea of the caravanserai. And the caravanserai, essentially, before I even explain what it is, think it's a rest stop. It essentially is a rest stop. It is a small kind of collection of buildings where merchant travelers, merchant caravans, they can stop off and get some supplies. Now I really want someone to make a Silk Road video game. Like, I mean, in the style of the Oregon Trail. Any computer programmers out there, make the Silk Road game. That would make this so much more fun to talk about. Well, not that it isn't fun to talk about. I love the Silk Road. So we have the rise of caravanserai, and this kind of new economic practice of having these rest stops, essentially, is going to allow for trade to go longer distances. And as such, caravanserai will lead to the expansion of trade routes like the Silk Road, but it'll also be practiced in the trans-Saharan trade, as we'll talk about later. But we also see, with the rise of overland trade, we see the rise of merchant companies. We see early corporations starting to pop up by the 1200s. And to help facilitate and allow for the rise of these merchant companies, we see the rise of banks. We see the rise of banks in Europe, of course, in places like northern Italy. But we also see the rise of banks across Eurasia. We see banks in the Song dynasty in China. We see banks in the Islamic world. So we are going to start to see a bigger kind of focus on economic development with new economic strategies like the bank, for example. But kind of something that might be in the back of your head that you've been wondering is, how do we kind of have currency exchange? Well, when we have unified empires like the Mongols, as we'll talk about later, we will have common currencies. But when we see kind of these different kingdoms pop up that have their own unique forms of money, we do need to have some sort of exchange rate. And that's where these bills of exchange come into play. These bills of exchange kind of act as an early form of currency exchange. What is the equivalent amount of one Chinese coin to, say, a coin found in the Islamic world, in the Abbasid Caliphate. So we do see kind of this rise of commercial practices, of trading practices like currency exchange, like these bills of exchange. But as a result of all of this economic activity, we see exchange of goods, the goods I talked about earlier. But a big thing that we're seeing is the diffusion of agriculture, especially of products like citrus from the Middle East going to Europe, for example, champo rice from Southeast Asia going to China, and bananas from Africa making their way to Southeast Asia. So, kind of how people eat food, or well, obviously not how they eat food, but what foods they eat, that's going to change because of overland trade and because of overseas trade as well, as we'll talk about later. But another big kind of thing that will spread on the Silk Road because of increased merchant activity is going to be disease. Outbreaks of disease are common when you see the rise of trade, both overland and overseas. So while we're seeing the rise of cities, we also do see plagues breaking out. And probably the most devastating that will break out is going to be the Black Death. And we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about the bubonic plague later on, but it's an example of something being diffused across the Silk Road. But we also see technology being diffused. We see gunpowder from China making its way into Europe, making its way into the Middle East. You know, I often wonder what they called gunpowder before guns, you know? Anyway, but a big thing that the Central Asian nomads in particular are going to promote and spread is going to be horseback technology. For example, the stirrup, which is going to kind of make it easier to ride horses and camels. In general, kind of practices of mounted warfare, the use of the short bow, as we'll talk about with the Mongols. But even something like the saddle, that's being first utilized by these nomadic societies, and it will be adopted by sedentary places as well. But finally, one of the biggest things that is diffusing is religion. Yes, indeed, religion diffuses with trade. And because of diffusion, we see examples of syncretism. So let's just see a little bit about the religions that are spreading. For one thing, things like Christianity will spread. We will see the development of a syncretic Christian religion called Nestorian Christianity. And Nestorian Christianity essentially blends together Central Asian, i.e., Mongolian, in the case of, well, the Mongols, influences with Christian symbols and Christian ideas. And you can see an example of this syncretism right here. I believe this is a tombstone, and it's written in Mongolian or Uyghur script. So Nestorian Christianity, an example of the result of Christian diffusion. But we also got the classics of religions that tend to spread along trade routes. We got Zoroastrianism in Persia. We got Islam basically everywhere. And we got Buddhism as well. Buddhism will be practiced by Central Asian nomads, but it's also going to diffuse into places like China from India because of Silk Road trade. And yet again, we see syncretism result in this. Chinese Buddhism is the mixture between Confucian and Taoism and Taoist ideas with obviously Buddhist practices. So you should definitely be able to answer this question right here. How are we seeing diffusion across the Silk Road? If you are sick of the word diffusion, I cannot blame you. Well, that's everything for this short presentation. We'll start talking about the Mongols in just a second. I need to get some water. Goodbye.